Did Bathsheba intentionally bathe where she could be seen by the king, or was she simply a victim of circumstance and of a monarch's unrestrained desire? To understand this first crucial point, we have to journey back into the ancient world of royal courts, strict social hierarchies, and the powerful impact of cultural norms. Picture the city of Jerusalem in the late afternoon. The Israelite army has marched off to war, but King David, known for his military prowess and spiritual devotion, remains at home. The palace stands on higher ground than most buildings in the city, granting the king a view of the rooftops below. One evening, as he walks along the palace terrace, David notices a woman bathing. Her name is Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah the Hittite, one of David's loyal soldiers still on the battlefield. Immediately, a murmur of controversy arises. Why was she bathing where David could see her? In ancient Israel, rooftop baths weren't unusual, and Bathsheba may have been observing a ritual purification rite required by Jewish law. The question of intentionality: did she plan to catch the king's attention, or was this simply the misfortune of being visible to the most powerful man in the land, is where arguments flare. Some have long accused Bathsheba of using her beauty to ensnare the king. Others argue that given strict gender and societal constraints, she was either unaware of David's watchful eyes or too powerless to alter the course of events when summoned. The notion of consent looms heavily here. In a monarchy, the king's word was effectively law, and refusal could carry dire consequences. So, while certain interpretations portray Bathsheba as a cunning temptress, a more nuanced reading reminds us that women in that era lived under tremendous social pressure. If David wanted her brought before him, Bathsheba had few, if any, realistic options to deny him. Whether she knew of his gaze or not, the inherent power imbalance makes it difficult to hold Bathsheba fully accountable for what followed. Yet the first question remains tantalizingly open. Was Bathsheba on that rooftop with the express intention of attracting David's attention? The text itself offers little clarity, allowing theologians, historians, and casual readers to fill the gaps with their own assumptions. Some point to cultural norms, bathing in a private but not necessarily hidden space, as evidence that this was routine, not seductive. Others claim that Bathsheba, aware of palace vantage points, could have been more discreet, thus fueling centuries of speculation. In the end, the uncertainty is precisely what makes this story so fascinating. It has sparked debates about power, agency, and moral responsibility, debates that extend far beyond the historical context. In our modern age, conversations about consent and victim blaming often echo the arguments that swirl around Bathsheba's first appearance in Scripture. Whether she wielded her beauty like a weapon or was simply living her life until fate put her in the path of a king's desire, her story remains an enduring lesson on how swiftly perceptions can shift when power, passion, and circumstance collide. King David's summons and the moral dilemma that cascaded from one hasty decision. Imagine the rush of adrenaline racing through David's mind the moment he realized he desired this woman. In a culture where monarchs held near absolute authority, David faced a line between righteous rule and personal indulgence, and in a heartbeat, he crossed it. With one order to his attendants, David set in motion a series of events fueled by secrecy and desperation. Bathsheba, a subject in the king's realm and the wife of a loyal soldier named Uriah, receives the summons. We can only speculate about her emotions in that moment. Fear, confusion, perhaps a sense of inevitability. She was being brought before the most powerful man in Israel. Even if she wanted to refuse, the cost could be unimaginable. This brings us to the heart of the moral conflict. Bathsheba's sense of agency was dwarfed by royal prerogative. Could a woman of her era truly tell the king no without risking her life and her family's safety? Or was she operating in a world where compliance was the only viable option? When Bathsheba steps into the royal chambers, the tension becomes palpable. On one hand, David, a celebrated leader renowned for his faith and prowess, faces a moment of conscience. He knows better. This is another man's wife, and that man is a trusted warrior fighting his battles. On the other hand, Bathsheba stands before him, carrying the weight of deeply ingrained social hierarchies. The biblical account only offers a sparse narrative of how the encounter unfolds, and that very silence opens the door to centuries of interpretation. Some see Bathsheba as entirely victimized, while others read into the silence that she might have been seduced by the allure of royal attention. Regardless of speculation, the moral and immoral realities become clear once we read what happens next. Bathsheba conceives a child, tying her fate inextricably to David's. Suddenly, a private affair becomes a looming scandal. The king, who once played his harp to soothe others, now frantically orchestrates deceptions to protect his own image. Bathsheba's pregnancy forces David to plot and strategize, all to mask an act of betrayal. While David's behavior amplifies in secrecy and cunning, Bathsheba's perspective remains largely undocumented, leaving questions about her emotional turmoil, her survival instincts, and her struggle to navigate a situation that seems destined for disaster. David summoned Bathsheba's husband, Uriah, from the battlefield under the pretense of wanting a report on the war. His real intention, of course, was far more personal. If Uriah could be coaxed into returning home to his wife, David might claim the child was his soldier's. It was a plan born out of fear, shame, and a king's desire to preserve his reputation at any cost. But Uriah, ever the honorable warrior, refused to enjoy the comforts of home and marital intimacy while his fellow soldiers slept on the hard ground of the battlefield. He slept at the palace gates instead, demonstrating a loyalty and selflessness that put David's own actions to shame. Deceit failed once, yet David tried again, this time attempting to manipulate Uriah with food and drink, hoping that in a moment of lowered inhibitions he might return to Bathsheba. Again, Uriah's integrity stood firm. Unable to bend Uriah's convictions, David was cornered by his own secrets. In a chilling turn, David sent word to his general, Joab, instructing him to place Uriah in the most dangerous position on the battlefield and then withdraw support so that Uriah would be killed by the enemy. In one of the most tragic ironies of biblical history, Uriah himself carried the very orders that sealed his doom. With Uriah out of the picture, David hoped his involvement would never come to light, and Bathsheba, now a grieving widow, would become his wife, masking the origins of her pregnancy. This ruthless cover-up not only cost Uriah his life, it also wove Bathsheba even more tightly into David's fate. She lost her husband, yet found herself tethered to the king who engineered his death. This entire scheme underscores how far a leader, even one lauded for his faith, can stray when propelled by fear and pride. Where once David was a symbol of devotion and moral leadership, he now orchestrated a plot that combined betrayal, manipulation, and murder. Bathsheba, meanwhile, was thrust into a public tragedy and forced into a new reality. She would bear the king's child, and for many, the reasons behind her sudden remarriage would linger in whispers and suspicion. In the wake of Uriah's death and Bathsheba's hurried transition from grieving widow to King David's wife, there seemed to be a cautious calm, at least on the surface. But the truth behind the king's orchestrations was not hidden for long. Enter Nathan the prophet, whose role in this story defines our next pivotal point. In a dramatic confrontation, Nathan crafted a parable about a rich man who stole a poor man's lone lamb, slaughtering the beloved animal for a feast. David, incensed by the injustice of the tale, declared that such a man deserved severe punishment. It was then that Nathan delivered his devastating punchline, "You are the man." In one of the most striking moments in the entire biblical narrative, the weight of David's guilt fell on him like a crushing burden. He stood accused not just by a prophet, but by the voice of God, who had witnessed every layer of deceit, from the moment David first summoned Bathsheba to the final betrayal of Uriah. The text tells us that David finally acknowledged his sin, and Nathan pronounced a series of consequences that would ripple through the king's household. Perhaps most heartbreaking of all was the death of Bathsheba's newborn son. In this grief-stricken episode, David fasted and prayed, clinging to the faint hope that God might spare the child. When the baby died, the king's sorrow was profound, and Bathsheba's heartbreak is left to our imagination, as the scripture offers few details of her internal anguish. Yet amid these harrowing losses, Bathsheba's journey was far from over. She remained in the royal court, a figure often overshadowed by the king's reputation and the family's ongoing turmoil. Still, she would become a central character in the lineage of Israel's monarchy, eventually bearing another son, Solomon, whose wisdom and reign would become legendary. This pairing of deep tragedy and future promise underscores the complexity of Bathsheba's role. She lived through unspeakable sorrow, wrestled with scandal, and ultimately emerged as the mother of one of Israel's greatest kings. Next, we'll turn to how Bathsheba's legacy and the ongoing debates about her agency have echoed throughout centuries of theological and cultural reflection. After the loss of their first child, the marriage between Bathsheba and King David continued against a backdrop of palace intrigue and familial unrest. The biblical text offers only brief glimpses of her emotional state, yet we know that she later bore David another son, Solomon, who would grow to become one of Israel's most renowned monarchs. This transition from grief-stricken mother to the queen mother of a future king underscores Bathsheba's resilience and, in many ways, her subtle political acumen. In a royal household fraught with power struggles, Bathsheba maintained a delicate position. Some commentators suggest that, with her status as one of David's wives and the mother of a surviving heir, she found ways to secure Solomon's legitimacy. Indeed, when David was old and frail, and questions of succession arose, Bathsheba played a significant role in ensuring that Solomon, not one of David's other sons, took the throne. Her influence was further cemented when Solomon himself ascended to power, and many scholars point to Bathsheba's position as the queen mother as a sign of both her royal dignity and her astute navigation of courtly politics. This final stage of her story prompts deeper reflection on how Bathsheba has been perceived throughout history. Was she merely a pawn, or did she wield considerable agency behind the scenes? The scriptures never fully articulate her mindset, but her trajectory, surviving the loss of her first husband, enduring the death of her child, and ultimately becoming the mother of Israel's fabled wise king, hints at a person who learned to adapt and quietly shape her destiny despite harrowing beginnings. In many modern interpretations, Bathsheba emerges not as a passive figure defined by a single scandal, but as a complex individual whose life bridged tragedy and triumph.